views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Coming up on this edition of Perspectives, it's been more than 60 years since the Supreme Court actually ruled separate but equal schools to be unconstitutional in Brown versus the Board of Education. But some say the COVID-19 pandemic has actually brought to light a new form of segregation. Lack of resources in high poverty area black schools where students are segregated by race and ethnicity. Coming up on this edition of Perspectives, we talk about that as the country contemplates on how to reopen schools. We'll discuss what this all means. That's front and center on this edition of Perspectives with yours truly, Daren Jaime.
What's on your mind? Express what's on your mind. What's on your mind?
Anything relevant to life, you bring it to the table. Whether you make a move solo or a movement with a stable. No fables, just speak on your decisions. Cause in the long run, it's your voice, your views, your vision. Keeping it real with many messages for you to know. This ain't radio, but DJ runs the show. Entertainment, he rocks it. Politics, he locks it. The host with the most would handle any topic. Don't forget to share your perspective with shines of light. Cause it might make a difference in someone else's life.
Make a difference in someone's life. Express what's in your heart and your mind. Share your perspective.
What's your perspective? Let them know.
And hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Perspectives. I am Daren Jaime. And of course, we thank you for joining us. As always, you can watch Perspectives every week here on BronxNet Channel 67. If you have Verizon Fios, that would be Channel 2133, or anytime on the web at bronxnet.org. Now, we encourage you, stay connected to us via social media. Yes, in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic, we have flipped to virtual, but social media has still been our lifeline. You can connect to me personally, DC Jaime 23 on Instagram and Twitter. And then, of course, my professional Facebook page, Daren C. Jaime. There you can get information as well as some inspiration. But coming up on today's show, we continue to talk about the topic of race, education, and America. Our guest in studio, a very special one. He's coming to us virtually, as we said. He's joining me to weigh in on these topics. His name is Mr. Arnold Burton. He's a teacher, a coach, a leader, a motivational speaker, as well as a consultant to many other educators. He spent over 29 years as an educator with the New York City Board of Education. He is currently serving as the chairperson of the Education Committee for the Stamford NAACP in Connecticut. He joins me now, and Arnold Burton, good to have you, Mr. Burton, here on Perspectives.
Good to be here. Good to be here.
Thank you. And so let's talk about it here. When we talk about the opening or the reopening of schools, a lot of parents, a lot of educators, very much concerned about the president's quickness and the swiftness in reopening schools. Some look at this as a different form of segregation. Others looking at it from a different perspective. How do you weigh in right now, given the fact that this conversation is going on and kids are actually going back to school?
Well, the way I look at it is that, number one, for me, I'm tired of everyone looking at the situation by the metrics and by data. Somehow we've lost the perspective of dealing with human beings, children, teachers, other ancillary people that work in the school, the custodians, etc., as well as the administration. These are all people. These are all lives that we're talking about. So it's extremely sensitive topic to talk about when you're thinking about the fact that when people go into these buildings, how safe is it for them to go back completely? I am of the ilk that I want to think about everyone being safe. As an educator, I've always focused on safety in schools. Even at one time I was a union rep, and one of the things that we all came together was that, is everybody safe? So the bottom line to me is, I'm always concerned about how decisions are going to be made with regard to the risk that is going to be experienced when children go back into these buildings. As you're noticing over the last couple of weeks, there are places in the country where this virus has spiked. And obviously down there, those places people are closing some of the schools. However, in Georgia, there's a school that opened up, and actually, from what I understand, what the news reports were, the kids were threatened that they'd be expelled if they did not come to school. And when they showed photos of the school, they showed the kids walking in the hallway. It was a high school, no masks on whatsoever. And evidently there were people who had already been known to have had the virus. So that is of great concern to me. And when it comes to the Black community, it raises to a higher level because of just the nature of the community, that most of the communities that we look at, especially in urban places, they are the low income side. So they do not have all the benefits that people who live in the suburbs or who make more money can afford with regard to how they protect themselves.
And when we talk about protection, obviously, you're sending kids into a classroom. And I'll talk specifically about Southern schools. Southern schools right now, a lot of them still are not enforcing masks. And so therefore, you don't have social distancing. You don't have them saying that masks are mandatory. In some places, you hear that masks are encouraged, but they're not mandatory. And so let's talk a little bit more about this in its perspective, that when you tell people, particularly students, that, masks are encouraged but not necessary, that's one problem. But then a second problem, which I've said to people before, is this whole push about trying to use students as pawns is part of a bigger economic problem, because the president seems to think that if we get students back to school, that means that you can get kids, or I should say parents, to get back to work, and the economy can get going. So talk about kids being used as pawns in this. Do you feel that way?
Of course, the bottom line is money. There are some people that look at the solution to everything as making money, and that our country, a capitalistic society, which we are very much about making money, and everything is penned around how well and how rich we are, et cetera, as being success. They do not care. The people on the top, it seems like they do not care, or they're not thinking about whether or not, again, these lives matter. And that with regard to our children, when you talk about children obviously are not adults who think the way we do. When you tell them about masks and being safe with masks, kids are going to take masks off. They're going to play. Even if they're wearing the mask, they're going to do the things that they would do, that a normal child's going to do, that's going to put them at risk to begin with. But the other thing is that when we talk about the fact that, the kids need their education, the kids need to stay alive. And the reason I say that is because if you look at the history of the world, United States of America, we haven't had that many huge monumental type of cataclysmic things like we have right now. We've had earthquakes, a tornado here, whatever. We had the World Trade Center, but that was localized mainly in New York. But this is the first time we have something that affects the whole country. In fact, it's affecting the whole world. The bottom line is Europe and that side of the pond, they have experienced tragedies for many years, world wars, where cities and nations have been devastated and people could not go to school. They had to survive. They had to just stay together as a family. And guess what? They did survive. It did not affect their education. They were able to catch up when things got better, but the push wasn't, we got to just send them out to go to school. That is a false premise that they're sending out, as if the children are going to suffer if they miss a couple of months of school. There are many ways to learn about things in life. And sometimes just learning the experience of how to survive something like this is a very valuable lesson. But our kids need to know that they're going to be safe, number one. The parents need to understand that, and they will catch up if they fall behind. But it is a fallacy to make people think that somehow they're losing out on life if for a few months they have to make an adjustment and school has to take the back seat. Not all the way in the back, because people can still learn, people can still be educated, but maybe in a different way as we're dealing with this craziness. But you're right, when you say they're being used as pawns, they're just being sacrificed for an economic reason, which is ridiculous.
I want to talk about black children, and then I want to talk about poverty and how those two things collide, and then how that plays out in the educational system. Let me take a quick break. I'll come back with more. We're pleased to be joined by Mr. Arnold Burton here, our guest on Perspectives. Stay with us. We're going to take a quick break. We got more show coming up right after this. And we're back here on Perspectives. Daren Jaime here with you, and we are talking about race, and we're talking about education. Our guest now, Arnold Burton, who's been sharing with us. He is heading the education committee for the NAACP in Stamford, Connecticut, a very big voice there in Stamford, Connecticut, and also across the tri-state area, former New York City educator, and we're glad to have him sharing with us here on Perspectives. Mr. Burton, let me bring you in on this particular statistic. When it talks about blacks and being in poverty schools, there was a recent article that was released when it comes to talking about blacks being involved in high poverty schools. And so let's take a look at it right here. And this is exactly what the article is saying. The article says, black children are highly likely to be in high poverty schools with a high share of students of color, but white students are not. And when you see the light blue graphic, there you can see black students coming in at 60%. Then you see white students who are coming in at 23.5%. That's low poverty and mostly white. And then when we talk about high poverty, that high poverty level, yeah, you see 8.4%. There you see the statistics. Dr. Burton, when you look at this, what do you say?
Well, again, when you look at the graphic, it goes to a deeper problem. Number one, people are poorer. People of color are poorer. They're not making as much money. And of course, so they're living a lot more in urban areas where you can have a great level of distance between those who are doing well and those who are not. And as you go down the level with regard to finances and the socioeconomic problems that come from that, you're going to, of course, see that black and brown children are going to be on the lower strata. The majority of the white kids who are maybe in the city, some of them, of course, are at that strata, but the majority are middle class and above. And so their schools, the atmosphere that they're in, the safety that they're in is a much different level on the positive side. I think that when we start to hit this, you're hitting a whole bunch of things, because the idea is that when you set up a school, people should have expectations for how well their children are going to do. And sometimes in the lower strata, the expectations just start out as low. They're not thinking. They're thinking that, well, the black kids, they'll do well in music and they'll do well in sports, right? And of course, occasionally we will have some children that excel, but the average child, they're looking with low expectations. I used to tell my children that when they come into my classroom, that my expectations are off the chart. My expectations for them are off the chart. And basically it's for them, each one of them, to become the best person that they can be in their society. So whatever that means, they're going to shoot for the top. They're not shooting for the bottom. In fact, we don't even talk about the bottom, because I don't want them living in that mindset. I don't want them thinking in that mindset. So the bottom line is to get them to think about people who they can emulate that will get them to go on the strata going upwards.
And when we talk about children in high poverty schools, give us an insight as to what that looks like, because when you're in a high poverty school, I don't think sometimes people get the real gist of how much of a struggle that is, not just for students, but sometimes even for educators, when you talk about resources, when you talk about things that go on within that building that maybe people just don't know about. So walk us through, when you're in a high poverty school, what are some of the challenges that maybe educators as well as students are facing that we really don't have much clue of?
Sometimes because of the neighborhood that they're living in, it's a challenge to get to the school, all right? Depending on whether or not there's a lot of violence, drug activity, et cetera, that may be in there, and the child may be a little afraid just to go to the school. Sometimes the child may have to take buses or be bused to places that they don't want to go to. But the bottom line is that a lot of the schools, the potential is there. But as I said, when people start to look at our children, they automatically think, okay, well, they don't need to have all the things, we'll keep them happy by letting them play ball and do that. So when you walk into a building like that, sometimes the building may not be as clean. You walk into the library, the books may not be up to date. They certainly may not have stories about our children and the history of our children. And so you start with that. You also may look at the classroom. What's the condition of the classroom? And again, I hit because, and I'm going to say two things here. Number one, I know a lot of great teachers, black and white. All right, teachers that really concerned, and they don't look at color, they look at their students. But you also will have an impression set by the aura of the school. If you come into the school, it's not clean. You walk in and you know that there's a safety that you feel when you're in that building. It's going to lower your morale. And a lot of teachers sometimes try to push through that to reach the children. When the children come in and they see a school like that, it's going to also make them feel a little low about how their school is and what they can do at their schools. I mean, I have been fortunate to teach at some very, very fine schools where the principals, I've had two remarkable principals that were off the chain with regard to their expectations. I think the principal that had the greatest impact on me, his name was Dr. Hill Brindle. He came from Harlem, but he taught at a school up in the Bronx, and he took that school to the highest level. But the expectations, he was almost like a Joe Clark, a little bit, I think, a little bit kinder than a Joe Clark, but at the same time, just as intelligent. So his expectations were very high. But once you have a building where there's no safety, and one of the things I'll say about Dr. Brindle is Dr. Brindle always made sure that the kids were safe on the outside of the building. So he hooked up with a police officer, a black police officer named Officer Scott. And the two of them would stand out, and he'd pull the rest of us. He said, Burton, come on outside. And we'd have to stand outside to make sure that the kids, they live across, the school was across the street from a housing project, could get to the school safely. And if we saw any problems, we would try and make sure we cleared out so the kids could get into the building. Once they got into the building, because of him, he created a safe environment. When you're in the lower income places, a lot of times the school buildings are not as safe as they should be. Kids can break in, kids can get out. There's problems with gangs, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, that's going to lower what can be done in the classroom.
And when we talk about a new form of separate but equal, with all of this that's going on right now, an argument can be made. This is a new form of separate but equal. We talked about Brown versus Board of Education years ago, but we can also make a real argument for what we're seeing right now in terms of separate but equal.
I think that what people need to understand is that I don't have a problem with the school being all black or all white. I have a problem with the school not having the same facilities and the same standards. All right. In Harlem, if you live in Harlem or you live in Bed-Stuy or someplace where it's predominantly people of color, these people are brilliant. Some of these kids, the people that are produced from there, they're brilliant. The thing about it is that the level of the expectation, again, I'm going to have to repeat that, has to be as high as their brilliance. All right. So when we talk about separate but equal, I'll throw it another way. There are a lot of buildings that are integrated. All right. They bus kids here and they bus kids there. That doesn't solve a problem, because when you put them in the class and they're in the school where it's integrated, the bottom line is that they may still end up in the lower functioning classes. All right. They may not allow the black kids or assume that they're not going to do as well. In fact, at the school that I taught at, again, a good school, some of the kids coming in, they would be placed, sometimes they would be placed, they're thinking about placing them in a lower functioning school, especially kids that came from other parts of the world where maybe they don't speak the same language or whatever. And I would say, no, don't do that. Put them in the high functioning class, because if they have to learn this language and they have to learn other things, they need to be around people who do what they do quite well. So they emulate people who speak well, who read well, et cetera, et cetera. And as we started to do that, you could see a difference. So when you mix a group of kids together and you put the black kids in a class with maybe Caucasian kids or whatever, but they're on the lower level, and you assume, well, they need to be at that level, that is not fair. We have had kids come in from different parts of the world where we put them in the honors classes or high functioning classes, and they do quite well, because you know what? They have the same type of brain. They're just as intelligent. And it's just that separate but equal is something that's not just a physical thing. It's a mental thing. How you perceive that child when they come in the building, and where you place them when they are put in their classes. I can tell you a story that, when I was in the middle school, the teacher one day was asking what would we want to be. And I said, probably said a doctor or a lawyer. And she said, no, you can't be that. And, she told me that, that's not, you're not going to become that. So I went home and I was very upset. My grandmother said to me, grandmother was from Trinidad, and she said to me, oh, my, no worry about that. She said, God didn't give you that big head for nothing. All right. She got a joke out of it. But that pushed me. The irony of it was that years later, I came back and I taught at the same school. The teacher that said that to me was still there, and I became a supervisor to her.
Amazing. Well, listen, great testimony. I want to continue this conversation. Just got to take a quick break. We'll talk more with Mr. Arnold Burton when we return right here on Perspectives. We'll be right back right after this. We're back here on Perspectives. Daren, Jaime here with you. Our guest today, Mr. Arnold Burton. He is the director of the Education Committee for the Stamford NAACP in Stamford, Connecticut, a former educator in the New York City public school system, and we're glad to have him sharing with us here on Perspectives as he's been sharing and bringing us some knowledge and information. But I want to tap into that knowledge a little bit more. And Mr. Burton, for us right now, we're very acquainted with the Black Lives Matter movement. Yeah. You grew up during the civil rights generation and that civil rights movement, the Kings, the Abernathys, and so many, the John Lewises, and all the other names that will get rendered as legends in the civil rights movement. The 60s had their movement. 2020 now has its movement. How do you measure, or how do you compare, and sometimes it's kind of hard, but it's also very fair, how do you compare the civil rights generation to what we're seeing right now with Black Lives Matter?
That's a good question. It's a challenge because, number one, the passion that was back in the day was probably a little higher. People really came out in droves. What you see right now, and it's very ironic because I've been telling people for years that nothing has really changed with regard to how Black men and women have been treated. And then with the George Floyd and the other incidents that have happened, the George Floyd, the reason I believe that the attention was so large is because of the pandemic. If the pandemic did anything positive, it brought attention to the situation with regard to Black men and how they get treated, because the whole world wasn't working. They had time to see it. They had time to study. If people had been going back to work as normal, it would just have been another killing, another situation, and it would not have been as focused on the way it is right now. So what we see is the whole world looking and saying, this is not right. But as Will Smith said in one of his interviews, this has been going on for a long time. All right. So, but in some ways, of course, because of technology and some of the people that we have that and our sports people who have a lot of money, and LeBron James and the like, who have been trying to bring attention by building schools for our kids and doing certain things like that, it's better. But in other ways, I'm not so sure that we've really made the impact that I would want us to make. And the reason is that marches, and they're great, they're very, very important. But what happens after the march? Do we go to the table and do we sit down? And when we sit down at the table and people say, well, what can we do, blah, 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 are they talking to us as equals? Or is they talking to us as if we're trying to get the crumbs? What is our attitude amongst our people? Back in the days with Martin Luther King and Jr. and the other greats that were there, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and the like, they were national figures. They were world figures where people knew who they were, and we all can look at them as our leader. We just had President Obama, Barack Obama, who was a leader in that way. But I think that one of the things that we need to focus on is having local leaders, people who in their neighborhoods can come together and lift the neighborhood up. Sometimes waiting for one person to spearhead everything, I think, is a big problem. We need also to look at situations where we start thinking about money and how we manage money. A lot of people say that there's a lot of money in the Black community, and there really is a lot of money. But the challenge is, how do we manage our money? How do we spend our money? Are there businesses in our community? I remember when I was a little boy, Harlem was completely Black. And, the businesses down there, they struggled, but they were sort of Black businesses. But you go down to Harlem now, it's completely different, because the Caucasians have realized that Harlem is the center of New York City. Well, you can go almost anywhere in New York, you can get there in 20 minutes from Harlem, from Manhattan. So when you go there now, it's a mixed group of people, and the businesses are not, for the most part, owned by our people. And that is holding us back from getting the recognition and, more important, the respect that we need to honor. There will always be challenges racially. We just know that's just the way we're just a wicked group of people who don't like to get along with each other. But the bottom line is, we can learn how to come together and garner respect from each other in the way we treat each other financially, educationally, etc. The money thing is a big thing. Our kids, and that's why school is so important, for our kids to learn how to count and how to manage. And they don't have to be all, PhDs in order to be successful, but they need to know how to manage their money so that when they become adults, they can take care of their families. They can be successful in ways and walk through the street and know that they're okay. So to me, that's the difference that I see, that or the subtlety that I see, that we're too stuck with regard to the marches. Marches are great, but after we march, we have to sit at the table. And like I said, if I'm going to sit at the table, I don't want to be coming there as, a non-equal. I don't want to be there as a commodity. I want to come as an equal.
And, working at the NAACP, I know that is front and center for you guys, dealing with the policy. There's another group of people that deal with the protests, but the NAACP has long and has a long and systemic history of dealing with the issue of policy. We're almost out of show, but I do want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the policies that you're dealing with front and center right now, that you want to see some modifications and some changes. Talk about the policies that you're working on right now and that you are connected to.
Well, I think one of the things that we're dealing with, not only in Stamford, is that the crime level, and how people are dealt with, how our children, our young men especially, are dealt with by the police. Are they treated as an equal in the justice system? Do they have the right to a fair trial? Are they going to get the legal representation that they need? I think that's one of the things that we're dealing with. We still have a lot of problems in some of the schools with regard to racism and how kids are treated, especially when kids are taken in and put into very high functioning schools. And the Caucasian kids, sometimes, not all, will look at them as, why are you here? How did you get here? Are you here on the end pass? I've heard terms used like that, where kids are really having a hard time, and we have to put a fight up through the courts to make sure that people are respected. There will always be someone that doesn't like you, but that doesn't mean you cannot be respected and treated as an equal. When you get to school, are you going to be placed in a classroom that's going to treat you in the same way? Respect is the big thing, and I think that policy, if you would go up the level all the way to the top, the NAACP and organizations like that, we are spending a lot of time on issues like that, where respect is still a huge thing. And the equal opportunities in school and in business, of course, obviously is another topic that we deal with a lot.
Well, I'll tell you, I've had a great time talking to you today. Certainly, it's been educational, it's been informative, and in its own way, it's been very much inspiring. Mr. Arnold Burton, thank you so much for being with us. I say Mr. Arnold Burton because my parents always taught me to respect my elders.
There you go.
And you are an elder statesman. You spoke about Harlem, and I'm born and raised in Harlem, so I feel the love about the gentrification of what's going on. Thank you so much for all that you brought us here today.
It's been my pleasure. I really enjoyed it, and God continue to bless you. You're a role model. Make sure you understand that. You're a role model.
Thank you so much. I'm honored by that. Thank you so much. Mr. Arnold Burton, our guest here on Perspectives. And yes, we want to thank him for joining us and want to thank you for watching too. Now listen, anytime that you want to catch Perspectives, anytime Bronx says Channel 67, you can also check us out on Verizon Files Channel 2133 and go back to bronxnet.org. There you can see some of the past episodes. You can be able to just line up and find out what is going on with regards to Perspectives. For all of us on this show, Curlew, Lindsay, myself, thank you for watching. Until the next time we meet, stay safe, share your perspective with somebody else. You just don't know. It might make a difference in somebody else's life. Take care and God bless.